Keeping with the Sunder theme, today we're going to cover a build that actually uses the new charms in a way most normal builds will, and that is as an endgame capstone rather than either an always use like the Necromancer or the Sorceress, or an always avoid type deal like, well, the Fist of the Heavens Paladin. Of course, to get to that capstone, you first need to get through the game, so let's talk about how to start, grow, and build your Fire Elementalist Druid throughout the game. Starting with normal, the Fire Druid is actually pretty powerful and can run fairly competitively with even the other Goliath normal builds, like the Holy Fire Paladin and the Fire Trapson, in basically how quickly they can cut through the fluff. And since we want to avoid using our skill resets, mainly so we can play around with them later as we get cool gear, having one that leads into a hell-capable build is even more enjoyable, and sometimes those other two builds just can't quite do that. Thankfully, he's pretty simple to start out with, going with just enough strength for gear and the rest in vitality, while chugging potions for mana. If you want, you can put some into energy to help with this, but as soon as you get into Nightmare, you'll find you don't need it as much, as well the rest of your gear will improve your, well, mana recovery to compensate. As far as skills, we start grabbing points in Firestorm from the onset, and in Act 1 you won't be able to spam it quite as much as you would like, but combining it with your normal attack will be fine. And as we progress through the rest of normal, we get to pick up plenty of other fun skills to make it all a bit more manageable. Grabbing Molten Boulder at level 6, which gives us a bit of physical damage with our fire, and with the speed change it's a ton of fun ever since 2.4. And we follow it with fire skill we'll probably be using well into Nightmare, and that is Fissure, an excellent area of effect fire spell that I even use in the final build, though really I use all of the fire skills when playing now thanks to them no longer sharing cooldowns. As far as side pickups, the most important is going to be Oak Sage, and I also generally start putting 1 point into each of the normal summons down the middle to get to Grizzly as well, just when they come up, so I can have some bodies for support and protecting my mercenary. Though with this particular character, I am getting Grizzly from my helmet, so I opted to skip them when I reset my skills for recording the gameplay footage for this build. Gear-wise, we want the usual stealth armor, which you can see in a breastplate here, but can be made in any armor. This is just the best since it's light armor and has a decent defense, though it's just as good in any of the leather armors if you want to make it in Act 1 rather than Act 2. We can also make some fun helmets out of lore, though you won't get a soul rune until later on in normal. They do make it worthwhile to save druid helms for, that can help you out. The way this one is different from the last few videos is you actually want to keep an eye out at Akara for the cheapest, no mods 2-stock-it staff you can find and put the runes Tyr and Rawl in it to make a leaf. Since we are fire, this will help us a ton with plus skills, mana per kill, and a few other nice things. And that should be more than enough to make it through normal difficulty using Fissure and Molten Boulder on crowds, and using Firestorm specifically on bosses since it can stack up a good deal of damage while you're hugging them. As we shift over into the Nightmare mindset, we start rounding out the rest of the skills, getting down to Grizzly in the summon tree so we can have a proper tank to stand with our mercenary. If you have wolves, they're nice for this as well, and you can summon them at the same time as the Grizzly thanks to the patch 2.4. In the fire tree, we start getting Armageddon and Volcano up and running as well. Personally, I prefer Fissure as my main for Nightmare, but as far as progress goes, you should choose one of the skills to focus on based on your comfort with that skill. Some people prefer Volcano over Fissure, for example, and they would focus on that instead. My personal path is Fissure into Armageddon, then Molten Boulder, Volcano, and then finally into Firestorm at the very end, as I find this to fit my personal playstyle the most, but there are more efficient routes if you're going for maximizing damage and speed. I prefer just going through relaxed. You may have noticed by now that I have a point over in Cyclone armor as well. I normally would not bother with this point unless you have a decent number of plus skills, which as you can guess gets pretty high when we put our elemental charms back on. If you don't have these plus skills, you'll just be recasting it all the time since it will be such a low value and we lack the points to really dump into it while still getting decent damage out of our skills, at least up to decimation levels that we like. But if you're playing with transferred gear, you can get this in Nightmare. As far as the Nightmare gear, it's going to be the usual Insight rune word for our mercenary, which works on Act 1 or Act 2 mercenaries depending on whether you want it in a bow or a polearm, though the Act 1 is definitely easier to keep alive. And for on our actual character, we pretty much will be going for Spirit, which in Hell we'll be able to make in a shield like this Monarch here, but most people will also make one in a broadsword found in Nightmare, so they can get the same faster cast and plus skill bump early on. I just don't have room to spare for it with the other gear we need to talk about in this video. That's because as we go into Hell, we get to start looking at late progression gear and chase gear as we continue to dump tons of points into our fire skills while going along. And one nice thing about the Druid's fire skills, several of them are half physical as well, so our risk of having problems with immunities pretty much go away, or go way down at the very least, since against fire immunes you still have Armageddon, Volcano, and Molten Boulder, allowing you to spam out large amounts of physical damage without a second thought, while for everything else you still have Fissure and Firestorm. Now, you may have noticed I mentioned still dealing with immunities. That's because you do not equip the Sundered Charm yet. That's because the 5% damage you get from it is not going to make up for the massive drop in fire resist, especially considering how common fire attacks are in the game, especially from dangerous enemies. No, we save the Sundered Charm for after we've gotten some of the chase gear to make it worth it, namely the minus resist things. Until then, it's just plus skills, plus resist, and use the right skills for the right enemies. Some budget items for this stage of things are things like Rain Armor, which is one of the better class armors in the game despite being often ignored, and this is mostly because the lightning resist plus skills and chance to cast Cyclone Armor are really handy. Though obviously in the end game we'll want to grab Enigma if we want Teleport, or Chains of Honor if you don't want Teleport. As far as chase gear, we have a few options, but beyond the usual plus skill sources like skill amulets, Arachnid Mesh, Stone of Jordan, and Mage Fist, which is super common on fire-based builds like this one, they're all just kind of standard fare for casters. It's going to be a very specific list though if we want to use the new Sundered mechanics. Starting with the shield, the obvious pick is going to be Phoenix, which is honestly a good shield even if you don't have the Sundered Charm. And while you can also make it in a weapon, and it is a great tool there as well, I generally prefer making it in a shield first, since it's better for multiple builds beyond this one, stretching that somewhat high cost further. On the weapon, like I said, we can do Phoenix, and it would actually give us more fire damage penetration. Or you can do Hand of Justice for some other perks, though I mainly just have it on here since I was playing around with it on a different Druid build recently, but it does have the perk of helping aggro enemies sooner with the Holy Fire effect, making them more likely to be pulled into your Armageddon radius. Lastly, the helmet, and this will be a debate until the end of days. One, you can go with the Ravenlore route, and it is probably the cheapest method, and it will net you the most potential damage if you socket it with a Rainbow Facet to push it even further. But personally, I like running Flickering Flame, especially since we plan to use this with a Sundered Charm. Since it comes with a decent amount of fire penetration, gives us the same boost to our fire skills at least, and it will work with a Druid Helm, which you can get some pretty decent items from. In this case, Volcano and such, though it can also spawn with Armageddon and Volcano, it's just super rare. The big reason I chose this though is that it provides the resist fire aura to compensate for Sundered penalty. Makes it my personal pick for a Sundered Fire Druid. Beyond that, it's just the usual elemental skill charms, Torch and Annihilus charm that you see fairly frequently on pretty much every build in the game. Though you may have also noticed that I'm no longer using the Meditation Mercenary. This is because we have Redemption from Phoenix, and there's actually two big options for your Mercenary here. Infinity, which is great for pushing that fire resistance down even further with Conviction, and it is a solid hell pick, and one most people will just go for, especially since now you have that Sundered Charm breaking the harder to pierce fire immunes. Though oddly enough, I still find myself favoring Reaper's Toll for the Decrepify. This, with Holy Freeze, just makes it feel so much better for me. It helps take advantage of both damage types in my skills, so it was sort of a tough choice between the two. I just prefer the feel of this one, even though both are entirely viable. So, do you enjoy the idea of a Fire Druid? Do you think with the Sundered changes they might actually be competitive, if not even more reliable than the Fire Sorceress? Mention it down below, and if you want to support the channel, click on one of the videos on screen now, or maybe even catch these videos a day early without ads over on the Patreon.